Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. And if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 18 of Stepping Wild. The shadows were stretching by the time Tibs sensed the oddity at the edge of his range. He'd spent the day walking and sensing, heading for anything that might have been someone or a mass of animal that would indicate they were feasting on or protecting their kill. Possibly possibly the missing man. The one such mass had been wolves, but the kill had been a deer. And now this. Even as far as it was, he could tell it wasn't an animal, and certainly not a dungeon creature. Now that he headed in that direction and the oddity stretched further, he could tell the essence was structured in an unnatural way that happened in the unnatural way that happened with buildings that were made with magic. Was that the what had was that what caused people who ventured deep into the forest not to return? An old sorcerer's home, its enchantment breaking down, and what? All he had to go by were songs of such places and the danger they represented, but he knew better than to trust bards and their songs. You know what? I don't need their songs to trust bards. Still, he could envision a sorcerer using traps to keep intruders away, and after the sorcerer died, over the centuries, the weaves degrading. They might let someone wander in, but not let them out. And if someone was lost in the forest, any building would seem like a safe place. But something in what he'd sensed made this feel off. If it was a building, it was vast, stretching well beyond what he sensed, both ahead and into the sides. And now that he had some precision, other than the gap he now headed for, there were no windows. There were where he'd expect to sense the remnant of enchantments. No door or archways. Once he was closer still, close enough he thought he should make it out among the trees, what he sensed didn't have the feel of a wall stretching on either side and within, but of uneven columns placed next to each other like a village palisade. It also wasn't made of stone or brick, as you'd expect, and such an ancient structure, as you'd expect such an ancient structure to be made of. Sorcerer's towers were always made of those and the songs. Then he was close enough to see the gap between the large trees. They were so close together they had to hide the structure he sensed. Well, Tibs froze. The voice came from all around him. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but the pleased tone came through clearly. Mirka, it called. There's already another one. The voice reminded him of Zachariah and others like them who came across us both. He started for the gap again. No, this wasn't a person the way Tibs was one. Somehow, even though he couldn't sense the stone of a cliff or a cliffside. Actually, you know what? I think cliffside is one word. All right, I guess not. Beyond the wall, he was hearing a dungeon. Really? The new voice sounded like an older version. Was Murkut a dungeon? Wait, this one's different. I know. Somehow the words carried a smirk. Oh, what do you think it means? I don't know. Murka replied, tone pensive. I wasn't taught they could have more than one element. It would be the helper, Tibs decided. But it has them, the dungeon said eagerly. That means this one's going to be fun, right? That it's going to do something, unlike the previous ones. Well, if you don't count the screaming and crying by the end. I hope this one lasts longer. Tibs now stood before the gap, and those uneven columns were the trees on each side, and stretching as far as he could see and sense, branches crossed at about twice his height, giving the impression of an archway. This was the dungeon's entrance. He was certain of it. But where was it? Where were the mountains, the cliff? Could there be a mound? Would that be enough? And then stretch under the ground where the tree walls were the tree walls to camouflage that, except that he couldn't sense corridors under him. And the walls of columns past the entrance were arranged to make halls and rooms. He stepped in, smiling. However it had happened, he had a dungeon the guild didn't control. Hi, I'm Tibs, he greeted them. What's your name? The silence was total, not even the rustling of leaves. He chuckled. I already heard you talking. I know you can hear me. I'd like to. The essence hit him before he could react, raw, thick, and accompanied by terrified gibberish. I'm not. His skull was cut off by the tree that grew and impaled him. That pain was added to another growing through his shoulder, and he slammed back against something that wasn't there, pinned. Stop! The leaves were over his face, in his mouth, and his throat. The pain was immense as it ripped, but but he couldn't scream, couldn't take in air to do so. Things grew into his chest, ripping and pushing part of him aside, causing his life essence to leak out. He tried to use earth for strength, but he couldn't focus. He had to do something, anything, to stop the dungeon from killing him this way. He hadn't avenged. He fell to all four, coughing, and thought he was hacking out his insides. There, a woman said, or possibly a girl. The hand rubbed his back. It's all right. You're here now. You do seem to find the most interesting ways to come to us. Where? He stopped as the expected rawness in his throat didn't manifest. He looked at his chest, which was fine. Even his armor was undamaged. There, he wasn't in pain or dying. He shuddered at the memory of his insides. How had he survived? Because you came to me, she said, and Tibs forced himself to look up, away from his uninjured body. She smiled at him, lips of delicate bark in a face of rougher wood, but lined in a way that Tibs thought men, who liked their women younger, would find attractive. Her eyes were the green of fresh summer grass, her hair fronds of willow with all color of flowers growing through them. She stood, and her body was made of different shades of wood, with flowers and moss growing in places women didn't expose to other people unless they had planned for them. You're wood. He stood in surprise at the realization. He was taller than she. Her head only went to his chest. She chuckled lightly. Oh, I am so much more. But wood is what those like you call me. His cheek burned. How do you want to be called? Why had he assumed that her name would be what her name would assume what? Her name would be just because it was what everyone else used. Whatever is easiest for you to understand. She motioned to the side, and the leaves that covered the ground rearranged themselves into a table and chairs. I believe you prefer sitting when having discussions? I don't mind standing, he replied, not wanting to impose. She smiled. But you prefer sitting. She motioned to a chair, and a tankard formed on the table. You also enjoy ale, but that isn't something I can offer, even if some of me goes into it. He sat. He'd forgotten how the elements knew everything about him since they took the words they used to speak from his mind. I didn't think I'd have another audience. A plate formed on the table. He chuckled. Are you offering a steak to go with the conversation? That is not something for me to offer, she replied gently, the plate remaining empty. He looked around at the trees and flowers and grass and mound of moss. He recognized some, but not most. You're all this. You said you're more than wood. You're nature, right? I am all this, she replied with a smile. What do you see? He looked around at the trees and flowers, the grass and mounds. He searched through and around them, trying to understand her question. He was about to ask when what was missing registered. There are no animals. Those are for another. But who would it be if not nature? The only possibility was fever. That was the element of the body, the flesh. People tended to think of it as only meaning people, but animals were made of the same stuff as people. Why did it take so long to have an audience? The right conditions are not always easy to achieve. But I've tried before many times. I spent months in the forest. There was this cave filled with crystal. Nothing happened. You stopped before the proper state was reached. I was fed up with it. He barely swallowed the anger. He'd tried for the strong emotions that were easy to trigger, but even channeling fire to fuel the anger, he hadn't been able to build it into the rage the way he had before. He'd contemplated impaling himself on a crystal spire, but hadn't been able to work up the courage. She placed a hand on his. You are here now. That's all. That is what matters, is it not? I guess. She studied him. Are you no longer on the path you set upon? No, he persisted. I still want to make them pay. There was no point in not being direct. She saw his mind. I just figured that I couldn't have an audience without having access to a dungeon. He frowned. What's with this one? Her eyebrow raised. The eyebrow she raised was made of delicate yellow petals. There aren't any mountains. How is it here? She shrugged. Dungeons are not of my making. Who made them? She smiled. Who made you? He rolled his eyes. About the only thing scholars agree is that we're all made of you. How that happened? I've heard and read more theories than the time I've asked. Purity made us, the cleric claims. We came from a dungeon, I heard once. I don't remember where. We just happened. We made ourselves. These answers apply to a dungeon as well as you, I expect. All I can say is that I did not make you, and I did not make them. So they don't have to be in a mountain to live. They can be under the ground? I do not know. Right, I guess Earth is who I have to ask. He had the tankard to his lip before remembering it was empty. He could do with ale for this. He placed it down. I guess I should get on with it. He sensed for the shadow looking around and was surprised to feel it within her, between her breast. Too easy. He paid more attention to their surrounding for any hint where the true shadows hid. Then he had no choice but to return to the one within her. It couldn't be. It was never that easy. Well, almost never. Corruption has simply handed it to him. Are you just letting me have it? You must take it, she stated. But you aren't going to test me? You're not going to have me solve some puzzle or force me to push through pain? Other than corruption, getting the shadow of the elements had never been pleasant. The small smile she responded with made him think he'd missed something. She watched him as he stood and stepped around the table, turning so she kept facing him. She didn't move beyond that. She didn't present her chest to him the way women who earned their coins by taking people to their bed would do. She watched him with what felt like affection or encouragement. The expression was difficult to discern with her face made of plants. He hesitated, finger close to the valley between her breasts, where he sensed the shadow. He took off his glove and immediately felt silly. The glove was no more real than he or she was. Everything was nothing more than essence in this place. His mind added the form he was comfortable with. Still, there was something disrespectful about touching her there with his hand covered. The skin was softer than he expected, warmer. There was something resembling the roughness of unfinished wood, but also something of how his flesh gave under the pressure of his finger and resisted being punctured. He frowned. He tried again, reminding himself that he or she wasn't solid here. He willed his fingers to be essence that passed through her flesh, or wooden flesh wouldn't let them pass. Are you stopping me from getting it? She considered something. I am not making it impossible for you to reach it. He smiled. So this is a test. Test he could work with. It was simply about working out the rules. He touched her as he stepped around her, tested the varying firmness of her flesh. Just because a shadow was close to the skin in front didn't mean that was how he was supposed to reach it. But by the time he'd done the circuit, the only way her flesh varied was in the same way people did. Bones close to the surface made it tougher. Muscles were also harder, but not as much. The tests had not told him anything of how to reach it. He placed a finger between her breast again. Maybe this was about testing his determination? He pushed. Then, when his finger didn't go in, he pushed harder. Her breathing hitched with a wince, and Tibs jerked his head away. Am I hurting you? Would this not hurt you? She asked, but without reproach. But you're an element. You aren't like me. She placed his hand between her breasts. I am of this. Do you not think the trees feel when you fell one? Do you think them things for you to use and throw away? He pulled his hand away, face burning with shame. There had been no accusation in her tone, but it was exactly how he thought about trees. He'd cut one down for its wood to feed a fire and not consider it or the other plants around. He'd also assumed that because the previous elements had been one way, she'd be the same. But they were all different. Plants weren't like stone or metal or air or darkness. Plants had life essence through them. He was going to have to be careful. Do as little damage as possible. I need a tool, something sharp. She looked at him impassively. All this is you, so you can make me something like that, right? He'd seen wooden swords cut people. All here is me, but you brought what is yours with you. With a frown, he turned his sense inward. His vast reserve was there, filled with life essence. The small, nearly non-existent ones of his other elements were at its surface. He had his bracers, but they had no reserves here. Then, when he tried channeling metal, nothing happened. He couldn't bring a new element here. What he had already was what he needed to work with. He could make it work. He only left a trace of metal essence in the reserve, enough for it not to be empty, and formed a delicate blade with it. He crouched before her and placed the point to her skin. The gentle pressure encountered resistance. As he considered how to proceed, a bead of clear liquid formed around the point and rolled down her skin. Her face was a mask of strain. You bleed? He asked in horror. Of course she did. Trees had sap going through them. When he made a gash in one, the sap bled out. With a curse, he stepped away. How badly can this hurt you? She shrugged. Has anyone else done this before? Another shrug. He wasn't the first one on this path. Water had told him that, but she hadn't said how far they'd gone. There was no order to the audiences. Maybe they'd never made it to her. Maybe she didn't know how badly this could hurt before, because she'd never been hurt like this. He looked at the wet tip of the blade and at her again. The tip of her finger was wet as she was looking, and she was looking at it as if the tip of her finger was wet as she pulled it away from her injury, and she was looking at it as if she'd never seen the liquid before. Could he do this? Hurt her? Take part of her? The shadow was always the price once he overcame the challenge. But this was different. This felt wrong. What if I decide I don't want it? Can I just leave? I can return you to where you are, which was in the process of trees growing through him, killing him. He needed the shadow to be immune to the trees, but doing so could. He crouched before her and took her hand in his. Is there another way? I don't want to hurt you. I'm not more important than you. It is where it is. Her expression was sad. If you want it, you need to take it. But it's going to affect you. He searched her face. What do you want? She smiled. I want what I am. For everything to grow, to change, to flourish. He looked at the prick his blade had made. What was behind there on people? But I can't just kill you to get that. It's not worth it. She shrugged and looked away. I can send you back. But he didn't want to die. He still had things to do, so he needed the shadow. He placed the blade on her chest again and pressed gently. He looked away at the beating liquid, then forced himself to watch what he was doing. He pressed harder, and she gasped. He eased the pressure and looked at her. At her face, at the pain on it, as she looked to the side. Look at me, he said gently. He wouldn't look away from the pain he was inflicting. She smiled and winced as he pushed the blade again. He had to stop. Part of him said his life wasn't worth that of an element. Except that was the test, wasn't it? She was an element. She couldn't die. She was trying to trick him. He pushed, and she wavered back. Eh, yeah, I mean, it's the pressure. And she moved. There's almost certainly a correct term. I just don't know it. There was a bone there. He hadn't been able to get himself to break it back then, even to save Stowe. Serba had been the one who'd saved him. She'd had the strength to do what was needed, even if it was going to cost her who she was. If Tibs faltered here, he'd be the one who paid. But was that so bad? Who was he to think he could do this to an element? And what happened if he died? Nothing, really. The world would go on. The guild would go on. He gripped the blade tighter. Mama's killers would go on. With a scream, he slammed the palm against the hilt, and the blade sank deep. He ignored her pain, gasped, and labored, breathing. He pushed a finger into the hole and used the little earth essence he had to increase his strength. The bones broke, and he reached in for the shadow. It melded into him, and a new reserve formed between earth and air. His vast reserve would be even larger now, but he'd long ago lost any sense of how deep it was. And that wasn't important. I have it. You can undo this. With a wet cough, she slumped forward. He caught her. She was heavier than she looked. You can stop, he said. It's over. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice cracking with a spasm. How did you not know? How didn't you know? He demanded. She looked at him, confused, and when she coughed, liquid dripped over her lips. He pulled her to him. I'm sorry, I didn't want this. I know. She smiled. I know that you. The world trailed off, and he held in her head. Slumped. He moved away, horrified at what he'd done. He made an etching of purity, but he didn't have enough essence, and she was already crumbling away, melting into the ground. What had he done? How could he have been so? I am proud of you. He jerked away from the touch, blade up, ready to. She smiled at him, standing before him. A glance showed him the little of her left being absorbed. Then he took her in, whole, unarmed. The obvious registered. I really hate, he grumbled, how I'm always forgetting you aren't real. I'd even reminded myself of that before. He motioned to the ground. Only part of him hadn't believed it. With barely any acting on her part, she'd fooled him completely. What's the point? He demanded, standing. He resisted the urge to step away as she approached. Everything begins. Everything grows. Everything ends. It's the way of all that exists out there. I know that, he snapped. I lost too much already not to. Her smile was sad. You don't. But that too is the way of those who exist out there. And you are a child of them. Tibs snorted. I haven't been a child in a long time. That is true, but you are still a child to us, all of you. Fine. He no longer felt like indulging her. What happens now? Now you go back. She placed a hand on his chest, but with a boon. What do you mean? It wouldn't do for you to end just as you leave here. But I have your essence. What can hurt me? A rule was broken, and even I am bound by them. But I, too, am not beyond pushing against rules if I feel so inclined. She smiled. With you, I do. But she shoved. And that concludes chapter 18 of Stepping Wild. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter will be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read this story, it is up for free on Royal Road. And if you want to support me and read ahead of that, that is on Ream Story. We're about 12 chapters ahead. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. The links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.